Good day. Today is Tuesday, 17th June 2025, and I'm going to say that last night, before I finished off the day, I thought that there was a distinct possibility that by this morning I would be reporting US strikes against Iran. I say that because clearly major deployments by the US military are underway. Not all of the forces, by any stretch of the imagination, are in place, but the president's behavior, Donald Trump's behavior, as it was playing out over the course of yesterday, suggested a man who was becoming increasingly angry, at least to me, and frustrated, probably surprised, as I suspect many people are, by the fact that things are not playing out in the conflict between Israel and Iran in the way that he might have expected and perhaps was promised, and perhaps also increasingly frustrated by signs of dissension and disagreement within his own administration. Anyway, it seemed to me that the president was becoming increasingly erratic and angry and was starting to talk in ways and act in ways that suggested that he was coming close to a decision to authorize a strike on Iran. Now, that strike didn't happen over the course of last night, and it hasn't happened today. And since this morning, Trump has been making more comments and statements which suggest that he's pulled back somewhat from that idea. But the realities of the situation in terms of the fighting that is taking place, the strikes that the Israelis are conducting against Iran and the strikes that Iran is conducting against Israel, all of those still to me point clearly to a long battle of attrition, one which Israel is not well cited to conduct, and one which the president himself, Donald Trump, must realize, if the United States gets drawn into it, will be critical and damaging for the United States and for his presidency, and which perhaps he's trying to might decide to end through military action, which, as I said, he perhaps hopes or imagines or believes or has been told will somehow bring this conflict quickly to an end. Now, why do I say all of this? Let's first of all look at Trump's behavior over the course of the day. Yesterday was a G7 meeting in Canada. It was clear to me that he went to this meeting in an extremely bad mood. He's never particularly liked the G7. He doesn't get on with any of the leaders there. There were nonetheless all kinds of attempts to try to, on the part of the organisers of the meeting, who of course the Canadians, to try to get some kind of meeting together which would not result in Donald Trump having some kind of a walkout or anything like that. And there were also some attempts to try to make sure that the unwanted visitor, Vladimir Zelensky from Ukraine, stayed away. I'm not absolutely clear whether he was in fact in Canada or not. I've heard reports before the meeting that he was indeed going to the G7 meeting, unsurprisingly, and that he would try to meet with Trump there. But if he was at the meeting, it doesn't seem as if he did in fact meet with Trump. Anyway, Trump went to the meeting. He didn't begin, but he started to say all sorts of things which I think would not have been welcome to many of the other attendees. He said that he thought it was a terrible mistake that the G8, as it once was, became the G7 through the expulsion of Russia from the group in 2014. He said that he thought that was a terrible mistake, that it made Russia an enemy of the West. If Russia had remained a member of the G8, then things might have been better. He gave the impression that he thought that Russia should be readmitted to the group and that it should become the G8 again. And when asked, he also suggested that it might be a good idea, or seemed to agree that it might be a good idea, if China were to join also, in which case, of course, it would be the G9. Well, we can argue about the history of the wisdom of the decisions that were made in 2014 to basically end the G8. It's important to stress that the G8 never replaced the G7. What used to happen, and I remember this very well, was that the G7 countries, the United States and the other Western allies, would meet. They would have their meeting, and after that meeting there would be a further meeting which Russia would attend, and which was then the G8. The Russians were never happy with that mechanism. They found it humiliating. They felt that all the main decisions were made by the G7 group and that they were then presented with them and expected to agree to them, and they didn't like it at all. Nonetheless, they went ahead with it, even though, as I said, they were never particularly keen on the G8 format. In 2014, as it happens, Russia was supposed to host a G8 meeting, and of course all that was called off at the time when the Ukraine crisis began, following the collapse of the Yanukovych government, the seizure of power by the Maidan movement, the events in Crimea, and all of those sort of things. To be frank, when the G8 format was ended, I think the Russians, some of them, were actually relieved that it had finally been brought to an end and that the Russians were in a position to move forward and sort things out by themselves. Anyway, as for re-establishing the G8 in any format, the Russians have repeatedly made clear that they are not interested, and if they were given an invitation, they would probably refuse. Trump brings this whole topic of the G8 up time and time again. He doesn't seem to be listening or paying much attention to what the Russians are saying. Perhaps he says this about the G7 really having been better if it had stayed the G8, because he knows it will rile and infuriate the other leaders, especially the European leaders, and it shows that he went into the meeting in a, frankly, extremely angry mood. Anyway, the meeting then continued. There was supposed to be a joint statement which apparently spoke about the need for a de-escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran, also made provisions apparently for strong inspections of Iranian nuclear facilities. Trump refused to sign it. He said that he was not interested in signing such a document because, straightforwardly, he doesn't appear to think that Iran should have any nuclear facilities. We'll come to all of that in a moment. So that statement was never published. A watered-down statement was published later. It says the usual boilerplate stuff about Israel having a right to defend itself and about Iran being the major disruptor in the situation in the Middle East. Extraordinary and bizarre statements, by the way, given that it was Israel that attacked Iran. And I discussed yesterday at length in my program why that attack would actually, under international law, constitute aggression. None of the steps that ought to be taken before a state goes to war were made. There was no ultimatum given to Iran, no information given to Iran that an attack Israel had resolved on an attack, no direct information by Israel to Iran. There was no attempt to bring the matter to the attention of the UN Security Council. And to drive the point home, there is information today in the US media that even though Israel endlessly and continuously and repeatedly says, as they have been saying since apparently 1984, that Iran was on the brink of acquiring nuclear weapons, the US intelligence community, it seems, had been briefing Donald Trump that, in fact, their view was that Iran was not pursuing the acquisition of a nuclear bomb and would be at least 3 years from being in a position to acquire such a bomb. And they apparently gave that advice to Trump as recently as March. So anyway, a G7 statement, which is the absolute opposite of the truth, but it's apparently the only kind of statement that the Americans were prepared to sign up to. Anyway, nonetheless, and notwithstanding, Trump walked out of the meeting early. He did so after he was supposed to sign a trade agreement with Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. This is the trade agreement that I've discussed and we've discussed on the Duran, the one that was negotiated in a hurry a short time ago, the one that leaves many of the tariffs that the United States has imposed on Britain still in place. Anyway, that trade agreement was signed. There was no proper ceremony during the actual exchange of papers. The document, the trade agreement, fell onto the ground. It had to be retrieved from the ground. The whole thing looked chaotic and disorganized. And I have to say this, I got the clear impression that Trump himself was hardly interested in the whole affair. Anyway, there were also supposed to be further sanctions imposed on Russia, some decision about further sanctions. The European Union, as we know, has been moving forward with its 18th sanctions package against Russia. There was supposed to be a EU attempt to try to get the G7 to agree to lower the price cap on Russian oil that can be ferried by oil tankers insured in London, from $60 a barrel to $45 a barrel. Apparently no consensus or agreement was reached on any of that. There's apparently been statements about sanctions, and the whole sanctions thing seems to be completely up in the air. And the Russians have been talking rather mischievously that the only outcome of the G7 meeting is that it demonstrated again that the sanctions on Russia had backfired and that it was the Western states that had suffered worse from them. And Kirill Dmitriev, the director of Russia's direct investment fund, has said that the United States has lost up to $300 billion as a result of the sanctions that the United States and the Western powers imposed on Russia, though I have no idea how that figure was calculated. Anyway, that's where we are. Trump leaving the meeting early without any kind of real explanation as to why he had done that, giving the entire the overwhelming impression that he really didn't want to be there, that he didn't like the people that he was meeting there, and that he was altogether in a bad mood. Well, that's, as I said, the visuals. But let's go to Trump's various comments. And he's been busy. He's been busy talking at some length. He's been posting things on Truth Social, all of which, as I said, show someone who is, I think, deeply frustrated and angry about the direction events are taking. So firstly, he lashed out at Tucker Carlson. Somebody please explain to kooky Tucker Carlson that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The words Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, capitalized. Then directly after that, another comment. America first means great things, including the fact that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Make America great again. And then a short time after that, a gratuitously rude comment about President Macron of France, who probably deserves it, I have to say this. Anyway, publicity-seeking President Emmanuel Macron of France mistakenly said that I left the G7 summit in Canada to go back to DC to work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Wrong! He has no idea why I'm now on my way to Washington, but it certainly has nothing to do with a ceasefire. Much bigger things than that, whether purposely or not. Emmanuel always gets it wrong. Stay tuned. Now, all that is interesting because, of course, if I can say, Trump has always, up to now, given the impression, or liked to give the impression, that he and Macron got on with each other. But this time, some of the anger clearly taken out on Macron. Then, apparently earlier than these other Truth Social posts, it's all coming up very jumbled on my feed. Anyway, perhaps the first one that he made, Iran should have signed the deal. I told them to sign. What a shame and waste of human life. Simply stated, again, and then the next words again capitalized. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I said it over and over again. Everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. Now that has attracted a lot of attention. The last words about everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. It was those words, by the way, that made me think more than any others that some kind of American strike on Iran was coming. But again, let's go back to the other point that Trump says. Iran should have signed the deal I told them to sign. Which deal was that exactly? His negotiator, Steve Witkoff, was supposed to be meeting with the Iranians on Sunday, on the 15th of June. There was a negotiation underway. What exactly was this deal that Trump was saying that Iran should sign? He's made statements at various times about the fact that Iran should entirely give up all nuclear enrichment. But the Iranians have pushed back on that. And as Trump, the great negotiator, should know, negotiations don't involve people simply coming along and agreeing to the first demand that is made on them. There is usually a complex process of negotiations, particularly over a topic like this. And as we know, the US intelligence community was briefing Trump that Iran was not, in fact, on the brink of obtaining a nuclear bomb, and that was not immediately on the horizon. It might have been 3 years on the horizon if Iran had actually sought to have a nuclear bomb. So he's constant harping about Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. It really does seem, frankly, beside the point. But I will come to that because I suspect it might have somewhat different meanings as well. Anyway, Trump, of course, then continues. He's also made, and this is on the previous day, about how Iran and Israel should make a deal, and will make a deal just like I got India and Pakistan to make, in that case by using trade with the United States to bring reason, cohesion and sanity into the talks, with two excellent leaders who are able to make a quick decision and stop. So all of that but and then he talks about Egypt and Africa and all of that, Ethiopia, and how they were prepared to go for peace. It was a rambling and frankly rather incoherent post from Trump on the previous day. But then there have been more statements from Trump since then. He's apparently he's now over the last short hour. He says, "I have not reached out to Iran for peace talks in any way, shape or form. This is just more highly fabricated fake news. If they want to talk, they know how to reach me. They should have taken the deal that was on the table, would have saved a lot of lives." Again, I ask the question, what deal on the table? As I understand it, a negotiation was underway, a negotiation which Trump himself at various times suggested was going in the right direction, and which his envoy, Chief Steve Witkoff, said the same, and which the Omani mediators also seem to think was going in the right direction. Anyway, then today, more statements from Trump, this time verbal ones, in conversation with CBS News reporter Jennifer Jacobs. This was apparently said whilst Trump was on board Air Force One. So it could be that he made these comments whilst he was flying from Canada to Washington. He said that the United States would come down so hard if they, meaning the Iranians, do anything to our people. And he also refused to say whether the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Secretary of Defense had provided him with planning options should the United States should Iran attack US bases. Now, some people will try and find some method in all of this. I myself can't see any sort of method at all. I think publishing these endless comments on Truth Social in the middle of a crisis is extremely unhelpful, to say the least. And I'm going to say something else, harping on constantly about the fact that Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb or a nuclear weapon, as if this was something that was imminently on the horizon, looks to me extraordinarily defensive. It suggests that Trump is busy trying to construct some kind of explanation for his actions, given the problems he's now having with his base. And there was another Truth Social post, which I can't find, in which he also said that he's the person who came up with the expression America first, and he's the person who defines what it means, and so it's entirely up to him whether the United States goes to war or not at any particular time. Again, the kind of statement that I suspect is more likely to annoy and infuriate people rather than to win them round. Another statement which to me looks defensive. Now, over the course of the last couple of hours, there's been a whole spate of media reports about arguments within the Pentagon. Supposedly, Elbridge Colby, the Assistant Defense Secretary, the person who has been constantly trying to get across the message that the United States is overextended, that it cannot maintain strong forces in Europe and strong forces in the Middle East at the same time as it is confronting China in the Pacific. Anyway, the reports say that Colby is extremely upset and very angry about this diversion of US force to the Middle East, and that he's arguing against it, or at least in some form. There are reports that Colby is himself being criticised, There's statements by Mitch McConnell, for example, saying that the isolationists, as McConnell talks about people like Colby, are not having a good week at the moment, which probably true, actually, but it does again suggest some kind of a fight going on. Trump's comments about Tucker Carlson suggest that there's been some pushback there as well. And, well, I've heard rumours, and they're only rumours, I can't confirm them, that other members, people in the administration, possibly, I'm guessing J.D. Vance, the vice president, who has always been a skeptic of US involvement in the conflict, in a conflict with Iran, that he has been speaking out to. I mean, anyway, there are rumours that there's been dissension and argument. Yesterday, there were reports that Trump had ordered a meeting of the National Security Council to take place in Washington, and that Trump intended to attend that meeting. That was another reason, by the way, why I thought that an attack on Iran might be in the course of preparation. But if there was a meeting of the National Security Council, the National Security Council, by the way, is itself in a state of chaos. Many of the staffers have been sacked. There is no national security advisor at the moment. The person who's fulfilling that role is the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Rubio, as far as I can see, has essentially gone to ground. We barely hear from him at a time of crisis like this. Anyway, the National Security Council was supposed to meet. I don't know whether it did meet. I don't know whether any decisions were made there, whether there was arguments, whether everybody was in agreement. But anyway, overall, and putting all of this together, it suggests to me a president who is bouncing from one position to another, who is angry and frustrated because things are not going the way that he expected. He did not intend, I think, that the United States would itself be directly involved in the attack on Iran. But I think he's now coming to understand that without the United States, Israel's punches are not landing. And that is the most important thing to understand about what has been taking place since Friday. Israel, as is so often the case with these sort of operations, began big. There was the strikes on Tehran, the killing of the top Iranian military commanders. Israel continues to claim that it's killing more scientists and more top commanders. Incredibly, only yesterday did Iran finally give instructions that senior officials needed to stop using mobile devices. I found it remarkable that it has taken Iran so long to understand that using cell phones and those kind of things is simply assisting Israel in targeting these senior officials. But anyway, Israel yesterday claimed that they'd killed another senior Iranian general. I've no doubt that they have killed him, by the way. They are claiming that this general is Iran's wartime chief of staff. I don't know what that word means, by the way. What distinguishes a wartime chief of staff from an actual chief of staff? Is it perhaps a way of amplifying the importance of this general, given that he is not, in fact, the chief of staff of Iran's military? But anyway, statements of that kind, and there have been more attempts by Israel to attack other locations in Tehran, and there have been more attacks on Iranian nuclear sites. And there's general acceptance that some damage was done to some of the buildings at the Natanz site. Grossi, the head of the IAEA, is saying that the destruction of some of the power generation facilities might have caused damage to the centrifuges located in Natanz, not because the centrifuges themselves were hit, they are deep underground, but because the lack of power would have caused some kind of problems to the centrifuges. I'm perfectly willing to believe that, by the way, that unless centrifuges are in constant motion, quite possibly they do suffer damage. But I would say that I can't imagine that the Iranians would not have provided fallback power supply systems, possibly located underground as well, to keep the centrifuges turning. Just saying. But then, I'm not going to pretend I know very much about what is going on in Natanz. Elsewhere, it's clear that the Israelis have not been able to do damage to Fordor, the big site with the centrifuges buried inside the mountain. And it seems that there's been only limited damage done to the other site in Isfahan. So in the meantime, Israel continues to strike at various targets. Some of them might be decoys. There were pictures yesterday of Israel attacking what looked like F-14 fighter jets left over from the days of the Shah of Iran. They date from the early 1970s, but they are the best fighter jets that Iran has. But these aircraft were parked and fairly visible from satellite pictures. They seem to be very prominent, which makes me wonder whether they might actually have been more decoys. I'm not going to try and speculate about all of this. But anyway, it seems to me that the Israelis are continuing to hit targets in Tehran and in western Iran. They don't seem to be making many efforts to attack targets in eastern Iran, which suggests that this is beyond the range of their aircraft and their missiles, which would not surprise me. By the way, as I've said already, Iran is an enormous country. But anyway, they seem to be striking targets and continuing to strike targets. And there is no doubt that they are doing damage. But, well, again, maybe I'm entirely wrong here. I'm not an expert in these things. I don't get the battlefield reports. But to me, it looks increasingly now like more of the same. And as I've been discussing in several programs, it seems the F-35s, the Iranians, by the way, claimed that they shot down another F-35 yesterday. The Israelis categorically deny that claim. Anyway, the F-35s are not designed for sustained combat. Sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, Israeli air attacks inside Iran are probably going to start to slacken. Israel has only limited stockpile of air-to-surface missiles, and importantly, in Israel itself, there is only a limited stockpile of air defense missiles. And in the meantime, Iranian missile strikes continue. There was what appears to have been a partially successful strike on a Mossad headquarters building in Israel. I believe it was located close to Tel Aviv. The Iranians appear to have struck other targets, and by the way, as I'm making this program, there are reports of more Israeli missiles heading towards Israel. So no doubt there will be more strikes as well. Now, I said in my program yesterday that it could be, and I fully accept that it may be that the Iron Dome and David Sling and Patriot and THAAD systems that make up Israel's air defense are working properly and are doing their job and are successfully shooting down missiles. I was provided with a very interesting explanation yesterday about how the Iron Dome system works in a different way from the Russian system. It doesn't aim to shoot down every missile that is launched, and that there are various ways that it operates, no doubt, to defend important locations in Israel. The point is that even if all that is correct, the image that is being circulated around the world and within Israel itself is of Iranian missiles being able to bypass the Iron Dome in numbers and succeeding in inflicting damage on locations in Israel. And this is starting to have an effect. There is an editorial in the Daily Telegraph, perhaps the most fervidly pro-Israeli newspaper in Britain, and that's saying something, by the way. And it contains within itself this paragraph: the biggest concern for America and Israel is that the vaunted Iron Dome shielding cities has been penetrated on several dozen occasions by the Iranians, causing death and injury. America, Britain, France and Jordan helped shoot down Iranian missiles in a previous attack, but were not involved this time. The last is not true. All of those countries have indeed been shooting down Iranian missiles and drones, but it seems that they're finding it more difficult to, that the sheer volume of Iranian attacks this time is causing increasing exhaustion amongst the air crews and the aircraft, and maybe depleting the number of air-to-air missiles that could be used against these targets. But consider again, the biggest concern for America and Israel is that the vaunted Iron Dome shielding cities has been penetrated on several dozen occasions by the Iranians. Now that is an editorial by the Daily Telegraph which appeared yesterday. One can sense the dismay here. And there's been a similar long article in the Financial Times, and the article reads, "How long can it last? Israel and Iran's endurance battle. Aerial war of cities pits IDF jets against Tehran's missile reserves." And again, the article talks about the fact that Israel now finds itself in a war of attrition. It speculates about the reserves of each side, the missile reserves of each side. It admits that missile experts can only guess how many missiles Iran has remaining and the level of sophistication, which is being weighed alongside the remaining magazine depth of Israeli anti-missile systems. Israel's layered defenses, Iron Dome, David Sling and Arrow, have brought down a vast majority of Iran's missiles and attack drones, but the reserves of interceptors are not infinite. As Ukraine has shown, the longer a conflict continues, the weaker interception rates tend to become. And then there's an awful lot of what I consider to be boilerplate claims which are unsupported by any evidence, but which might perhaps be true, that Israeli strikes are far more precise on Iranian targets than Iranian strikes are on Israeli targets. There's claims that Iran may have a stockpile of 2,000 missiles capable of reaching Israel. This is information provided by Israel, and that Iran has already burned through 350 of them. But others are more skeptical. They wonder whether, in fact, the reserve might be much greater. We're told that Iranian security figures have suggested Tehran's deadliest missiles are still in reserve, possibly waiting for Israel's stock of interceptors to be depleted. And the Financial Times is reporting an interview that one of Khamenei's advisors, Vahidi, gave to the Tasnim news agency. This is Brigadier General Ahmad Vahidi, to give him his correct name. Anyway, Vahidi says that reports about Iran's missile stockpile shrinking are ridiculous. We haven't yet fully tapped into our strategic missile prowess. We shall deploy our modern warfare, including new generation missiles, as and when we deem fit. And so we can see that in the British media, at least, doubts are beginning to grow that there's been no ability to break Iran's into Iran's nuclear enrichment sites, and there are growing worries that despite the real damage that Israel is inflicting on Iran, it is Israel which is losing the war of attrition. Now, this is actually completely unsurprising. I already said that Iran has a population of, I understand it's 92 million, and a vast territory. Israel is a small country of 10 million people. It has a relatively small industrial base, certainly by comparison with Iran's, and it may be a very advanced industrial base, but in any attrition, it is the scale that matters, and Iran's scale inevitably is greater than Israel's. I'm going to give another example. In many of the strikes that have been taking place upon Israel, Iran has been targeting the Israeli city of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is either the biggest city in Israel, if you consider East Jerusalem to be Palestinian territory, or the second biggest city in Israel, if, as Israel and the United States and some other countries do, you recognize undivided Jerusalem as an Israeli city and the capital of Israel. Tel Aviv has a population of around 500,000 people. Tehran, the Iranian capital, has a population of around 10 million. And if you include the larger metropolitan area, as perhaps for this purpose you should, because that's where many of the industrial facilities will be located, Tehran has a population of around 17 million. There is a massive difference in scale. Obviously, a metropolitan area of 17 million can absorb a lot more damage than a population centre of 500,000 can do. So even if Israel is conducting many more strikes on Tehran than Iran is conducting against Tel Aviv, over time, it will be Tel Aviv that will be more badly and effectively damaged than Tehran will be, all other things being equal. Just saying. So here we see again the dynamic of attrition war start to play out. Now, yesterday, maybe because of this worry that there is an attrition war underway, one that apparently nobody anticipated, and the alarm that that is causing, the Wall Street Journal, which is near-con central as far as the American mainstream media is concerned, started to claim that Iran was making all sorts of pleas for immediate negotiations, for ceasefires, that they were begging for some kind of a ceasefire. I would be very skeptical about any such claims coming from the Wall Street Journal or Reuters or any such media outlet. It seems to me that at best, the Wall Street Journal is misrepresenting statements that Iranian officials regularly make, that Iran is willing to de-escalate if Israel is willing to de-escalate, and that Iran will cease fire on Israel if Israel ceases to attack Iran. It seems to me that some people in the Wall Street Journal might be spinning that to imply that Iran is begging for negotiations. Anyway, the Iranians denied the entire Wall Street Journal report entirely, in its entirety. And they said that it simply wasn't true. And I suspect that at some level, it probably isn't true. Now, if things continue as they are, then at some point, we probably will have a ceasefire. Israel will be unable to sustain this offensive against Iran. It will probably start to scale down and then end its offensive, which apparently anyway was only scheduled to last for perhaps 2 weeks. And then Iran will probably also end its attacks on Israel. And then we will find ourselves in a situation where Israel has failed to achieve any of its stated objectives. The nuclear facilities in Iran are still mostly intact. Iran will have demonstrated its resilience and its capabilities and will come out in a stronger position, as Lindsey Graham has warned. So, the pressure is going to be on. It's going to be on the administration in Washington to prevent that happening. The various advocates of a showdown with Iran who see this as a real possibility are going to heighten their demands on the President of the United States to authorize an attack on Iran. The strategic bombers with their huge bunker-busting bombs, it will be said, should be unleashed. The tension will grow. And as we saw over the course of the last 24 hours, the President himself sometimes drifts towards giving the appearance that he's made that decision. And then at other moments, he appears to pull back. And, well, we are uncertain exactly how and when this is going. I would add that contrary to what perhaps the Israelis and the Americans appeared to have imagined, there's some evidence that Iran's air defense system has actually begun to work more effectively over the last couple of days. since the first strikes. And that might mean, that could quite plausibly mean, that the nuclear facilities, once the bombers come, might be more effectively defended than they have been up to now. If, of course, a B-2 bomber is shot down over Iran, then, I mean, the implications of that would be terrible for the United States. Anyway, so the president finds himself, the United States finds itself in an incredibly difficult position, and one can see the set of misjudgments that have been made. If the president presses forward and joins Israel in this attack on Iran, then he will have upset a key part of his base. His various comments on Truth Social suggest that that is hitting home, which is why, as I said, he's harping on nuclear weapons, Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, which it has repeatedly said it doesn't want to do, and which Trump's own intelligence agencies are saying Iran has no intention to do. As I said, I can't help escape the feeling that Trump expected that this would all be over by now, that there would have been some kind of internal crisis within Iran, or, and in this, it reminds me a little of the tariff war with China, that he was expecting after the attack that the Iranians would indeed come and start making big concessions and pleading with him to agree to end the fighting, the attacks, in return for Iran entirely abandoning nuclear enrichment, and that he's becoming frustrated that this is not happening and that Iran instead appears to be digging in. So anyway, there we are. That's the situation as I see it at the moment. We are balanced between further war, we are not in peace, between an American attack on Iran and not. I do get the sense that there is some actual pushback against it. Trump must be worried that his administration could splinter whichever way he goes, and at the same time, he finds himself in a situation with Iran where he is left without any good options. Now, Trump, of course, talks about the fact that he's not seeking a ceasefire, that he's not seeking negotiations. He's previously floated the idea that Vladimir Putin might do that job for him, that it might be Putin who acts as the mediator in this matter. That, as I said, didn't go down at all well with the Europeans. The Russians seem for the moment to be much more skeptical, because they don't seem to have much sense that either party is interested in mediation at this time. There was an article about this in Izvestia, important Russian newspaper. In Soviet era, in the Soviet era, it used to be the official newspaper of the Soviet government. It isn't that anymore. But anyway, Izvestia still is an authoritative newspaper, or a fairly authoritative newspaper in Russian terms. And it says that Russia has proposed its mediation services with officials in the Federation Council, that's the upper house of the Russian parliament, telling Izvestia that Moscow is doing everything possible to bring an end to the hostilities in the Middle East. Diplomatic initiatives from various actors may play a significant role in the conflict. Possible intermediaries include Cyprus. I can't understand why Cyprus would want to be involved, and certain Gulf states. However, the risk of the conflict spreading remains high, particularly if Western nations, by which of course they mean America, the United States, becomes directly involved. And then we've had Grigory Karasin, the chairman of the Federation Council's Committee on International Affairs, who it was, if we remember, the chief negotiator in the talks between the Americans and the Russians about reviving the Black Sea grain deal, negotiations which in the end failed, by the way. Anyway, he is quoted as saying everything has been done to ensure that this growing confrontation does not drag on. In any case, Russia stands for the termination of this military standoff and the return of peace in the Middle East. And then a Russian expert, an academic, Tigran Meloyan, I say Russian, his name suggests that he's of Armenian background, but never mind. He says that a prolonged war is not in Israel's interest, even with ongoing US military and intelligence support. Israel's small economy and the high cost of its aerial capabilities play a significant role. Notice this is the Russian media now saying this. Previously, as I said, I was quoting the British media. It is entirely plausible that in response to Iranian attacks, Israel may begin launching systematic strikes against Iran's oil extraction and refining infrastructure. Well, of course, they've already been doing that, but I discussed in a previous video how this can only do limited damage. And then he goes on to say Iran could play its next card, the threat to block the Strait of Hormuz, a move that could trigger a global energy crisis. And then we have another Russian expert, Vladimir Sajin, talking to Nezavisimaya Gazeta, another important Russian newspaper, saying that Israel is now targeting vital components of Iran's economy and infrastructure, which incidentally is not necessarily in Israel's own interests. When essential facilities to a population's basic needs are destroyed, the people rally together. And Sajin said that he doesn't believe that one can confidently predict the Iranian regime's collapse. So the Russians, my impression from these articles in this, that the Russians don't think that they're in a position to mediate anything at the present time. The Israelis still have hopes of getting the Americans involved and will continue to press for that, at least for the next couple of weeks, whilst the Iranians sense that the advantage is gradually passing to them. If you go to Iranian news sites like Tasnim, for example, you can see a gradual return of confidence as they sense that the balance of advantage is moving in their favour. So I think this has, at the very least, some weeks still to go. What happens eventually depends ultimately on Donald Trump. If he decides to involve the United States in another war in the Middle East, it will eventually, in my opinion, lead to a crisis within his own administration. It could still become a war of attrition. I don't know whether the Americans really can destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. Maybe they can, but one way or the other, as I said, the war quite likely will go on. Even if the Americans destroy the nuclear facilities, does that actually mean that the fighting would end? Might not Iran continue its missile strikes on Israel, maybe expand them against American targets across the Middle East? The United States could easily find itself dragged into another war. And all of this in order to prevent Iran achieving a nuclear weapons capability, which the American intelligence community says would be at least 3 years away, at a time when the Iranians were apparently close to an agreement with the United States, whereby they were willing to surrender their highly enriched uranium to the Russians. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are about the situation in the Middle East. Even as all of this is going on, the war in Ukraine continues. And I spoke yesterday about the increasingly panicky statements coming from President Zelensky of Ukraine. Those have continued and intensified. And last night, the Russians conducted their biggest strike on Kiev since the start of the special military operation. And of course, strikes on Kiev, on Ukraine, attract little attention today because the entire focus is on the fighting between Israel and Iran. And I'm going to state my own view that if you're talking about the totality of the ordnance that is falling on Kiev, it is significantly more than the totality of the ordnance that the Israelis are dropping on Tehran. And Tehran, by the way, is a much bigger city than Kiev. Anyway, the Ukrainians, as they now like to do, claim that they shot down virtually everything that the Russians launched against Kiev, including all of the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. The film footage tells a completely different story. In fact, it suggests that Russian missiles and drones were striking targets across Kiev without any real effective opposition from the Ukrainian air defense system at all. It seemed to me from the film footage, which is, by the way, becoming increasingly extensive, the Ukrainians in the past have attempted to suppress all filming of Russian missile and drone attacks. But it looks as if their attempts to contain, to prevent this kind of information circulating are starting to break down, which is an interesting fact in itself. Anyway, the drone and the film footage that's coming out of Kiev suggests many strikes on many locations and vast plumes of smoke from one of the airfields, the Zhuleni airfield near Kiev, which is apparently the one where the Patriot missiles mostly are located. There have been many strikes on this airfield. I get the sense that many batteries, Patriot missile batteries, have been either damaged or destroyed. But this time, the plume of smoke was particularly heavy. And there are reports that the destruction this time was extremely extensive. Anyway, one way or the other, a lot of damage done. And as I said, I personally didn't see much evidence of any Ukrainian air defense at all. The Ukrainians have, in my opinion, always overstated the extent of their success in shooting down Russian missiles and drones. They were doing that right from the first day of the Russian missile offensive in October 2022. But the difference between what the Ukrainians claim and what the visual imagery shows is now reaching baroque dimensions. And I have to say that I think the Ukrainians are doing themselves no favors by making these claims. On the contrary, they are destroying their credibility. They are moving into Baghdad Bob territory, if I can put it in that way. I would add that even as the Ukrainians make these claims of enormous success in shooting down Russian missiles and drones over Kiev, Zelensky himself continues to complain about the paucities and weaknesses of the Ukrainian air defense system. Just to say, the Ukrainians, Zelensky, are now openly talking about the fact that the West is abandoning them that the United States is now entirely focused on the Middle East, that it is no longer providing Ukraine with the support that it needs. And of course, from a Ukrainian point of view, a prolonged war of attrition between Iran and Israel would be, at this particular juncture, the worst conceivable disaster. And even as the situation in the sky becomes increasingly disastrous for Ukraine, the Russians continue to advance in Ukraine. Now, there were lots of reports yesterday about how the Russians have made significant further advances in the Sumy area. Simplikius the Thinker has an interesting article today on his blog talking about how the Ukrainians are now convinced that it is in Sumy region that the major blow against them is about to fall. The reality is that everything is going wrong on every part of the front line. So, for example, in the Siversk area, the Russians have captured conclusively a village called Grigorovka, which is located northeast of Siversk. They appear to have consolidated their control of the territory around Verkhokamyanska, which is located immediately to the east of Siversk. There's reports that the Russians are now in the process of attacking and storming the village of Serebyanka, which is located to the west of Grigorovka. If they capture Serebyanka, then Siversk is taken in a semicircle. And Simplikius the Thinker made the point, by the way, that the Russians have now returned to that very same area, close to the Seversky Donetsk River, where back in May 2022, in an incident that was made a lot of at the time, Russian armored unit that was fording the Seversky Donetsk River was caught by artillery fire and suffered extensive damage, and a lot of the films and footage of that damage then circulated in the media at that time. I remember talking about it at the time on one of my programs. But anyway, the Russians have now returned to that area, only this time they give every impression that they intend to stay. And in the Chasiv Yar area, the Russians have now captured, it seems, the entirety of Chasiv Yar. The only places where the Ukrainians still hold positions is in the westernmost area of the Shevchenko micro-district, which I believe, though I may be wrong about this, is not actually contiguous with the central area of Chasiv Yar. But anyway, it looks as if the Ukrainians are going to be pushed out of that place too. And there are further reports that the Russians have made more advances south of Konstantinovka, that they're capturing more positions around Pokrovsk, northeast of Pokrovsk, that they have captured fully the village of Udachny, southwest of Pokrovsk. I haven't seen any confirmation of this, but that would be an end of a prolonged battle, just to say. And that the Russians are also accelerating their advances in Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Ukrainians are few in number. At least those are the reports. Now, there are also Russian advances in other areas, but I'm not going to discuss them further in this program. Now, it has gone entirely unnoticed, but even as the Russians continue their advances in Ukraine, even as the Russians conduct these enormous strikes on Kiev, they have upped their demands on Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry, one of its top officials, has just made a statement, which I am no doubt at all was an authorized statement. He's reported to be saying that as part of any negotiated outcome to the conflict, Ukraine must dispose of all of its Western supplied military equipment, with the implication that in future any independent Ukrainian state will no longer be able to buy military equipment from the West, not even with the reduced size of the armed forces that the Russians would presumably permit it under the terms of the Istanbul Plus proposals and the Istanbul Memorandum that the Russians presented to the Ukrainians about 2 weeks ago. So, with every day, not only is there less of Ukraine, but the Russians increase their demands on Ukraine. Ukraine, meanwhile, has accepted now the 6,000 bodies that the Russians have provided, the bodies of the dead Ukrainian soldiers. And again, as if to take advantage of the deep embarrassment that the Ukrainian authorities undoubtedly feel over this issue, the Russians have now offered to provide Ukraine with another 2,000 bodies. In return, incidentally, the Ukrainians were only able to give the Russians 78 bodies in return for the 6,000 that the Russians gave them. Now, it could be that this is a further sign of the imbalance in casualties, that Russian casualties are indeed much lower than Ukrainian casualties, or it could be that the Ukrainians make no effort to collect Russian bodies, whereas the Russians collect Ukrainian bodies. I'm not going to get into that discussion in this program. But it does seem as if the Russians are now working on another updated set of proposals for the next meeting that they want to see happen with Ukraine, which supposedly should be after the 22nd of June. In other words, in about 5 days' time. I wonder whether that meeting will ever happen. And it does look as if at the next meeting, the Russians will simply up their demands, even as Ukraine refuses to accede to Russian demands and is being pushed back across the battlefields. Now, there is, just as there's been this chaos and muddle about US policy in relation to Iran, whether the United States intends to become directly involved in the war or not, just as we've had chaotic statements, a whole succession of chaotic and astonishing statements from President Trump on Truth Social and in comments to the media, comments which have also been frankly critical of key supporters like Tucker Carlson. So we're getting now contradictory signals from the United States about whether it is indeed interested in improving relations with Russia. So yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, announced that the United States had abruptly called off talks which were supposed to take place in Moscow to improve the relations between Russia and the United States, to facilitate the work of the embassies of each country in the capital of the other, and as far as the Russians were concerned, also to improve, to eventually provide for the return of Russian diplomatic property, which, as the Russians say, contrary to international law, the United States seized in 2016. Well, there's been much discussion about this, and over the last few hours, Putin's foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, now says that the process of normalization of relations between Russia and the United States, that relationship, that process is now under ice it is now put on ice. And Ushakov said this. Now, obviously, it was originally agreed to hold the next meeting on the normalization of relations in Moscow, but later the Americans suggested a break. Now, obviously, some kind of an agreement will be reached between the State Department and the Foreign Ministry on where and when to hold the next meeting. So far, the issue has been somewhat suspended. Now, a lot of people are making a great deal about this, but I am not actually myself surprised or especially concerned about this move. I always thought that a discussion in Moscow, of all places, where the Americans agreed in the Russian capital to return Russian diplomatic property, which the Americans illegally seized in 2016, would be a considerable stretch. I think that some people in the Trump administration were probably worried about the optics and about how the media in the United States might spin it as an American capitulation in Moscow to Russian demands. Beyond that, there is, of course, the situation in the Middle East, and I'm guessing that the president himself, Donald Trump, and his officials are completely absorbed with having to deal with that. So I don't read too much into this. It must be said that other signals from Donald Trump himself continue to point in the opposite direction. I've already discussed how he has again raised this, as far as I'm concerned, dead issue of Russia one day returning to the G7 and the G7 again becoming the G8. He's also spoken about his continued reluctance to impose sanctions on on Russia. It seems that the G7 did not agree to reduce the oil price cap on Russian oil from $60 to $45, as I already discussed. And certainly Trump didn't give any hint that he supported Lindsey Graham's bone-crushing sanctions at this particular point in time. So those are perhaps stronger actions than this decision to delay the talks which were due to happen in Moscow. But against that, the timing was, to say the least, unfortunate, and maybe this could have been done in a better way. I mean, it could have been arranged so that the Americans provided some explanation to the Russians. Perhaps they could have said that they didn't feel that it was a good idea to hold the talks in Moscow at this time, or that it might be premature for the moment to meet because the Americans were still working through the Russian proposals on the return of the diplomatic property. Simply cancelling the meeting without much in the way of an explanation does unavoidably send a negative signal. I have to say, it's all of a piece with a chaotic administration that I don't really think seems to know very much of what it is doing. Now, I say that just as I'm wrapping up this video. I see that there are reports circulating. They've been confirmed by both Larry Johnson and Alistair Crook, two people who I have absolute confidence in these sort of matters, that Trump apparently wants J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff to meet with Iranian officials at some undisclosed location to see whether some kind of way can be found out of this conflict that is taking place in the Middle East at the present time. The trouble is, it's not clear to me whether Vance and Witkoff are going to be carrying some kind of ultimatum with them to the Iranians, telling the Iranians to capitulate, or the United States will immediately attack Iran, for example, or whether they're going with a view to trying to start some kind of dialogue with Iran to try to get the United States out of this impossible situation that Donald Trump has maneuvered it into. I very much fear and suspect the former rather than the latter. But anyway, here again, we see the confused way in which this administration now works. The president says one thing, his officials do something completely different. The president says one thing one day about the conflict in Iran. The next day he says again something completely different. He calls President Putin of Russia crazy one week. He then speaks of President Putin as his best friend the next. Some people try to find some logic in all of this, some method in it. I got to say it frankly, I cannot myself see any method here at all. All I can see is that the United States is on a pathway to just another great war in the Middle East against an adversary that I think it underestimates and misunderstands straight after it has failed disastrously in another war against an even greater adversary, Russia, in Ukraine. Again, an adversary that it neither knew very much about nor properly understood. Anyway, we'll see what happens over the next 24 hours. If we are indeed at war, the United States is indeed at war with Iran tomorrow, I will not be surprised if President Trump is announcing that he thinks the war has gone as far as it needs to go, and now's the moment to pause and to think. That, frankly, won't surprise me either, though to be clear, I don't expect that to happen. One way or the other, we are in a state where things look to me to be out of control, and that is the worst thing one can say about a situation in the contemporary world and about the individual at the center of all this, the President of the United States, who is causing it. Well, that finishes my program for today. There'll be more from me soon, to be precise tomorrow. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.